Three deaf boys help a Hell's Angel with a flat tire on a lonely desert road. They thought it was just a simple act of kindness. But the next day, 500 roaring bikers thunder into their tiny town. At first, everyone's terrified. Leather jackets, tattoos, engines shaking the ground. But what they came to do, no one could have imagined. These boys who couldn't hear had changed the hearts of men the world feared most. And when tragedy strikes, those same bikers return, not for revenge, but for redemption. A burned-down community, a broken biker, a town that's lost its faith, all about to learn that sometimes the loudest voices come from the quietest souls. Will the kindness of three silent boys be enough to rebuild what hatred destroyed? Or will the roar of the past drown out their miracle before it even begins? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun hung low over Clayton Ridge, painting the desert landscape in shades of amber and gold. Three brothers pedaled their bikes along the dusty road, leading away from the hands of Grace Thrift Store, their shadows stretching long behind them. Though no words passed between them, their hands danced through the air in animated conversation, their faces alive with expression. Eli, the eldest at 17, led the way with careful attention. His dark eyes scanned the road ahead, while his hands occasionally left the handlebars to respond to his younger brother's excited signing. The responsibility of being the oldest showed in his watchful gaze and protective positioning, always keeping his brothers in sight. 15-year-old Noah rode in the middle, his artistic soul captured by the way the sunlight painted everything it touched. His messenger bag, filled with sketchbooks and pencils, bounced against his hip as he rode. Every few minutes, he would point out something beautiful to Sammy: a flowering cactus, a soaring hawk, or the way the clouds caught the evening light. 12-year-old Sammy, the youngest, brought up the rear with boundless energy. His infectious smile never seemed to fade, even as sweat dampened his curly black hair. His bike weaved playfully from side to side as he signed animated responses to his brother's observations, his hands telling stories that needed no sound to convey their joy. The three brothers shared more than their dark hair and warm brown eyes. They shared a world of silence that had shaped them since birth. But in their silence, they had found a different kind of music, one made of movement, expression, and understanding that went deeper than words could reach. As they approached their modest trailer on the outskirts of town, the scent of their mother's cooking drifted out to greet them. Maria Alvarez stood at the window, her hands deep in dishwater as she watched her boys return home. The sight of them always made her heart swell with equal parts pride and concern. Pride in the fine young men they were becoming, and concern for the challenges they faced in a world that wasn't always kind to those who were different. The boys parked their bikes against the side of the trailer, carefully arranging them in their usual spots. Eli helped Sammy secure his bike, ruffling his younger brother's hair affectionately. Noah paused to sketch quickly in his notebook, capturing the way the setting sun silhouetted their home against the desert sky. Inside, Maria dried her hands on her apron and moved to greet each of her sons with a warm embrace. Her eyes crinkled with love as she signed, "Did you have a good day at the store?" Sammy's hands flew with excitement as he described helping to organize the children's books. Noah showed her a sketch he'd made of an elderly woman who had visited the store, her face etched with kindness. Eli reported on the day's sales with the same careful attention to detail he gave everything in life. Maria's fingers moved gracefully as she signed, "Wash up now, boys. Dinner's almost ready." She had learned sign language alongside her sons, determined that their home would never be a place where they felt unheard or misunderstood. The small trailer filled with the silent bustle of family routine. The brothers took turns at the bathroom sink, playfully jostling for space in the narrow hallway. Their movements were a well-practiced dance, each knowing exactly when to step aside or move forward, their communication flowing seamlessly through gestures and expressions. The kitchen table was small but well-loved, its surface bearing the marks of countless family meals. Maria set out plates of enchiladas, the recipe passed down from her own mother. Steam rose from the dishes as the family gathered, hands joining in prayer before they ate. In the quiet of their home, the love between them spoke volumes without making a sound. As they ate, Maria watched her sons with careful eyes that missed nothing. She saw the slight furrow in Eli's brow that meant he was worried about something at school. She noticed how Noah's fingers twitched occasionally, eager to capture some new inspiration in his sketchbook. She observed Sammy's boundless energy, even after a long day of volunteering. After dinner, as the sky darkened to purple beyond their windows, Maria gathered her boys for their nightly routine. She helped Sammy with his homework, while Eli worked on fixing a broken lamp, and Noah sketched in the corner. The peaceful scene was one she treasured, knowing how precious these moments were. As bedtime approached, Maria made her rounds, tucking in each son, as she had done since they were small. To Sammy she signed "Sweet Dreams" and kissed his forehead, smiling at the way he snuggled into his pillows. With Noah, she paused to admire his latest drawing, her pride evident in her gentle touch on his shoulder. For Eli, she shared a quiet moment of understanding, her hand squeezing his in silent support of all he carried as the eldest. In the darkness of the hallway, Maria pressed her hands together in prayer, her lips moving in silent supplication. "Lord," she whispered, "watch over my boys. Help them find kindness in this world. Let others see their beautiful hearts, not just their silence." As she finished her prayer, a new sound reached her, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines carrying across the desert night. The sound was faint but growing stronger, like thunder approaching from far away. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she made the sign of the cross, her mother's intuition telling her that change was coming to their quiet lives. Through their bedroom windows, the three brothers slept peacefully, unaware of the approaching engines. Their world of silence remained undisturbed, but fate was rolling toward Clayton Ridge on two wheels, about to transform their lives in ways none of them could imagine. The desert night stretched vast and star-filled above their humble trailer, while the sound of motorcycles grew ever closer, like the heartbeat of destiny itself approaching through the darkness. Maria stood at her kitchen window, her reflection ghostly in the glass, watching the empty road and wondering what tomorrow would bring for her precious sons. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the desert road as Eli, Noah, and Sammy Alvarez pedaled their bicycles toward home. Their backpacks were heavy with leftover donations from the hands of Grace Thrift Store, bits and pieces that hadn't sold but were too good to throw away. The heat waves rippled off the asphalt, making the distant mountains dance like mirages. Eli, at the front of their small convoy, noticed it first. A massive Harley-Davidson motorcycle pulled over on the shoulder about a mile outside of town. Its chrome was dulled by a thick layer of road dust, and beside it stood a mountain of a man. Even from a distance, they could see the frustration in his posture as he circled the bike, stopping frequently to glare at the rear tire. The boys slowed their approach, carefully assessing the situation. The man was intimidating. Well over 6 feet tall, with massive shoulders and arms covered in colorful tattoos that disappeared beneath a leather vest. His gray beard reached halfway down his chest, and his weathered face spoke of countless miles on the open road. Randy Bear Maddox kicked at the flat tire, cursing under his breath. The sound of bicycle tires crunching on gravel made him look up, his expression darkening at the sight of 3 young boys coming to a stop nearby. "Keep moving," he growled, turning back to his predicament. Eli exchanged glances with his brothers, their hands moving in quick, silent conversation. Noah looked uncertain, but Sammy's eyes were wide with curiosity. After a moment's discussion, Eli made a decision. He dismounted his bike and approached the stranded biker, reaching into his backpack. Bear straightened to his full height, his massive frame casting a long shadow. "What did I just say?" he demanded, but his voice faltered as he realized something was different about these kids. They weren't speaking, just moving their hands in patterns he didn't understand. Eli pulled out a small tire patch kit and held it up, pointing to the flat tire. His expression was earnest, his movements careful but confident. Bear's eyes narrowed as understanding dawned. "Well, ain't that just perfect?" he muttered. "I don't need help from kids who can't even hear." He turned away, shaking his head, but the boys didn't leave. Instead, Noah and Sammy joined their brother, parking their bikes and approaching the motorcycle. Sammy held up a water bottle while Noah started examining the tire. Their coordinated movements spoke of years of working together, understanding each other without words. Bear watched, bemused and slightly uncomfortable, as Eli laid out the patch kit's contents with practiced precision. The boy's hands moved surely, checking the tire for the puncture point. When he found it, he looked up at Bear and pointed, raising his eyebrows in question. "Fine," Bear grumbled, throwing his hands up in surrender. "Have at it. Can't make it any worse." What followed was a lesson in silent efficiency. Eli directed his brothers through gestures and expressions, creating a seamless workflow. Noah held the tire steady while Sammy fetched tools from their backpacks. The boys worked with focused determination, unbothered by the heat or Bear's looming presence. As they worked, Bear found himself drawn into their silent world. He watched as they communicated through quick glances and subtle movements, their understanding of each other deeper than words could express. When Sammy spilled some water, Noah handed him a rag before he could even ask for it. When Eli needed a different tool, it was in his hand almost before he signaled for it. The patch was applied expertly, and Eli showed Bear the repaired section, pointing out the work they'd done. The big biker knelt down, inspecting the tire with a critical eye. To his surprise, the patch job was professional, better than some he'd seen in proper shops. Standing up, Bear brushed the dust from his jeans, feeling a strange mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. These kids had helped him without hesitation, despite his gruff dismissal. They'd worked together with more grace and efficiency than many grown men he knew. The boys started packing up their tools, ready to continue their journey home. Before they could mount their bikes, Bear reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out 3 leather coins, each worn smooth around the edges from years of handling. On one side was an embossed angel wing, the detail still sharp despite the leather's age. "Hold up," he called out, then remembered they couldn't hear him. He stepped forward, holding out the coins. When they turned back, he pressed a coin into each boy's palm, closing their fingers around them. "You boys ever need help? You'll have it," he said gruffly, making sure they could see his face clearly as he spoke. He wasn't sure if they could read lips, but he wanted them to understand the sincerity of his words. The brothers examined the coins with interest, running their fingers over the angel wing design. Then, simultaneously, they looked up at Bear and signed, "Thank you," their free hands moving from their lips outward in the universal gesture of gratitude. Their smiles were genuine and bright, untouched by fear or judgment. Bear swung his leg over the motorcycle and kicked it to life. The engine's rumble filled the air, and he saw the boys react to the vibration, their faces showing delight at the powerful machine. With a final nod to the brothers, he guided the Harley back onto the road and twisted the throttle. The boys waved as he rode away, the dust kicked up by his tires swirling in the hot afternoon air. They watched until he disappeared over the horizon, 3 leather coins clutched tightly in their hands, unaware that their simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would touch hundreds of lives. Standing there on the desert road, the Alvarez brothers tucked their new treasures safely away and mounted their bicycles once more. The sun was still high, the heat still intense, but they rode with lighter hearts, having turned a stranger's frustration into an unexpected connection. The kitchen in the Alvarez trailer filled with warmth as Maria kneaded masa dough with practiced hands. Steam rose from the pot of simmering chicken, and the spicy aroma of chilies and cumin wrapped around them like a familiar embrace. The boys gathered around their small kitchen table, their movements synchronized as they assembled tamales for tomorrow's bake sale. Eli spread the masa on corn husks with careful precision, while Noah spooned the filling and Sammy folded each tamale with determination. Maria watched her sons work, her heart swelling with pride. Their hands moved in a graceful dance, signing jokes and stories between tasks. "These will help raise money for new books," Maria signed, her fingers still coated in masa. The Hands of Hope Community Center meant everything to her family. It was more than just a building. It was where her boys could truly be themselves. Through the window, the desert sunset painted the sky in deep purples and oranges. Maria noticed Eli trying to share the story about helping the biker, his hands animated as he described the motorcycle. She smiled, translating his excitement into careful movements of tamale preparation. By 7 o'clock, they had prepared 5 dozen tamales. Maria wrapped them carefully in foil, ready for tomorrow's sale. The boys helped clean the kitchen, their movements efficient from years of working together in the small space. At the community center, Reverend Luke waited by the front door. His weathered face creased into a warm smile as the Alvarez family approached with their contribution. The old building might not look like much from the outside, with its faded paint and creaky steps, but inside it held countless stories of hope. "These smell wonderful, Maria," Reverend Luke said, helping them carry the tamales inside. He turned to the boys, signing slowly but with genuine affection. "I heard about what you did today, helping that stranded biker." The boys exchanged surprised looks. News traveled fast in their small town. Reverend Luke's eyes twinkled as he continued both speaking and signing. "Good deeds echo longer than thunder, boys. Never forget that." Inside, the community center hummed with activity despite the late hour. A few other families were dropping off baked goods for tomorrow's sale. The walls were covered with artwork from the special needs programs, and a corner held shelves of well-worn books in braille and large print. This was their sanctuary, a place where differences were celebrated rather than hidden. The boys helped Reverend Luke store the food in the kitchen, while Maria arranged items on the display tables for tomorrow. As they worked, the pastor shared gentle stories about their father, who had helped build some of the center's furniture before his passing. The boys soaked in every word, their eyes bright with memories. At 8:30, it was time to lock up. The boys helped Reverend Luke check all the windows, while Maria made sure the kitchen was secure. The old building creaked as they moved through it, familiar sounds in a place that felt like a second home. "See you tomorrow for the sale," Reverend Luke signed, giving each boy a pat on the shoulder before they left. The night air had grown cool, stars twinkling above the desert landscape as they drove home. Hours later, Maria jolted awake to the sound of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through their trailer windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The boys, feeling the vibrations, were already at the window, their faces pressed against the glass in horror. Flames reached toward the night sky, consuming the community center. Fire trucks surrounded the building, their lights cutting through the smoke that billowed into the darkness. Maria rushed to her sons, wrapping her arms around them as they watched their sanctuary burn. The roof groaned and collapsed inward, sending sparks shooting into the air. Firefighters battled the blaze, but it was clear the building couldn't be saved. Maria felt her sons trembling against her as decades of memories turned to ash. Mayor Douglas Price arrived in his pressed suit, standing at a safe distance with his arms crossed. He spoke with the fire chief, who gestured at the building while explaining something. The mayor's face remained impassive, as if he were discussing nothing more important than a weather report. When the fire chief approached Maria and the boys, his face was grim beneath the soot. "Looks like faulty." "Wiring," he said, shaking his head. "These old buildings, you know how it goes." Mayor Price joined them, his polished shoes incongruous among the ash and debris. "Well," he said, barely glancing at the family. "It was an old building that had its time. Perhaps this is for the best." Maria's hands trembled as she translated his words for her sons. Eli's face hardened, while tears slid down Sammy's cheeks. Noah stared at the smoking ruins, his fingers spelling out home over and over. Dawn broke over Clayton Ridge, painting the sky in pale pink and gold. The charred skeleton of the community center still smoked, a black wound in the heart of their town. People gathered to stare at the destruction, shaking their heads and murmuring about what a shame it was. The boys stood with their mother, watching as their artwork, their books, and their sense of belonging lay in ashes before them. The morning air was thick with smoke and loss. For the Alvarez brothers, the silence that had always been part of their world had never felt more overwhelming, more isolating than it did in that moment. Maria held her sons close, her heart breaking as she watched them sign to each other with shaking hands. Their sanctuary was gone, and with it, a piece of their world had crumbled into the silence that surrounded them. 2 days after the fire, the morning sun cast long shadows across the charred remains of the Hands of Hope Community Center. Maria Alvarez and her 3 sons stood before the ruins, their hearts heavy but their spirits determined. Eli, Noah, and Sammy carried handmade signs they'd worked on all night, carefully painted with the words, "We will rebuild," in bright, hopeful colors. The boys placed their signs carefully among the ashes, their movements gentle and reverent. Maria watched her sons, her eyes glistening with pride at their unwavering hope. The signs stood out against the blackened rubble, like flowers pushing through desert sand. Mayor Douglas Price's polished shoes crunched across the debris as he approached, his face set in its usual mask of administrative indifference. He cleared his throat, drawing attention to himself as he adjusted his tie. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said, his voice carrying the practiced patience of a man used to saying no. "I understand your sentiment, but there's simply no funding for this. The building wasn't properly insured, and the city budget can't cover such an expense." Maria translated his words into sign language for her boys, her movements sharp with frustration. Eli's shoulders slumped, while Noah kicked at a piece of charred wood. Little Sammy pressed closer to his mother's side, his fingers clutching her sleeve. Reverend Luke appeared beside them, his weathered face creased with concern. He placed a comforting hand on Maria's shoulder, but even his usually confident eyes held shadows of doubt. The pastor had spent the past 2 days making calls, seeking help from other churches and community organizations, but had found little support. "We must have faith," he said softly, though his voice wavered. "Sometimes the Lord's answers come from unexpected places." As if in response to his words, a low rumble began to fill the valley. At first it was just a distant hum, barely noticeable. Then it grew louder, building like approaching thunder. The vibrations reached the boys through the ground, and they turned toward the sound, curious. First came 5 motorcycles, then 10, then dozens more. They appeared on the horizon like a gleaming river of chrome and leather, flowing toward Clayton Ridge in an endless stream. The rumble became a roar as more and more bikes joined the procession. Townspeople emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the extraordinary sight. They gathered at safe distances, watching with a mixture of awe and apprehension as motorcycle after motorcycle rolled into town. The convoy seemed endless. 50 bikes became 100, then 200, then 500, until the streets of Clayton Ridge were filled with the largest gathering of bikers the town had ever seen. Each rider wore a leather jacket adorned with the same angel wing emblem that decorated the coins the boys had received from Bear. The symbol caught the sunlight, flashing like beacons across the sea of leather and chrome. The massive group came to a coordinated stop beside the ruins of the community center. The rumble of engines died away one by one until only the tick of cooling metal broke the stunned silence that had fallen over Clayton Ridge. At the head of the group, a familiar figure dismounted his Harley-Davidson. Randy Bear Maddox removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were both fierce and kind. He walked toward the Alvarez family, his boots leaving clear prints in the ash. "These boys," Bear said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "helped me when no one else would. Didn't matter that they couldn't hear. Didn't matter that I looked rough. They just saw someone who needed help and gave it." He paused, looking at the ruins, then back at the boys. "Now we're here to help them." Maria covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears spilling down her cheeks as she translated Bear's words for her sons. The boys' faces lit up with recognition as they spotted the biker who had given them the coins. Mayor Price stepped forward, his authority clearly rattled by the unexpected arrival of 500 bikers. "Now see here," he began, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Bear turned to face him, his presence somehow both intimidating and dignified. "We've got contractors, electricians, plumbers, and carpenters among us, all licensed, all willing to work for free. All we need is your okay, Mr. Mayor." Reverend Luke's face broke into a wide smile as he murmured, "God works in strange ways indeed." He began translating Bear's words into sign language alongside Maria, his movements fluid with joy. The bikers began setting up camp in the vacant lot beside the ruins, their practiced movement suggesting they'd done this many times before. Tents appeared like mushrooms after rain, and the smell of coffee and cooking food soon drifted across the area. The sun began to set over Clayton Ridge, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The town buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in years. People who had initially locked their doors at the bikers' arrival now wandered closer, drawn by curiosity and the infectious spirit of hope that had descended on their community. Children darted between the motorcycles, admiring the gleaming machines while their parents chatted with leather-clad riders who turned out to be teachers, nurses, and business owners. The Alvarez boys moved through the crowd, their hands flying in excited conversation as many of the bikers, to their amazement, responded in sign language. The evening air filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the occasional rev of a motorcycle. For the first time since the fire, the town crackled with possibility. Even those who had been skeptical found themselves caught up in the wave of nervous wonder that swept through Clayton Ridge. Maria watched it all from beside the ruins, her heart full as she saw her sons being welcomed into this unexpected community. Bear stood nearby, directing his people with quiet authority, occasionally glancing at the boys with a hint of a smile beneath his gray beard. The night settled over the impromptu camp, and campfires dotted the darkness like earthbound stars. The town that had seemed so broken just days before now hummed with life and purpose. Hope had arrived on 2 wheels, wearing leather and bearing angel wings. The morning sun rose over Clayton Ridge, casting long shadows across the sea of motorcycles that lined the streets. Chrome gleamed like mirrors in the early light, and leather jackets hung over handlebars as their owners gathered for breakfast. The sweet aroma of coffee and bacon drifted from several camping stoves, mixing with the crisp desert air. Townspeople began trickling toward the ruins of the community center, drawn by both curiosity and concern. Some kept their distance, hovering at the edges of the gathering with arms crossed and faces pinched with worry. Others moved closer, carrying thermoses of coffee and plates of home-baked goods. Bear stood at the center of it all, his massive frame commanding attention as he addressed the growing crowd. "We're the Desert Wings Brotherhood," he announced, his gravelly voice carrying across the morning air. "Some of you might have heard of us. We do charity rides, help veterans, build houses for folks who need them." He gestured to the gathered bikers, who stood in a loose semicircle behind him. "Every person here has a skill to offer, and we're offering them free of charge." Maria Alvarez stood nearby, quickly translating Bear's words into sign language for her sons. Eli, Noah, and Sammy watched with bright eyes, their hands moving in excited conversation. When Bear paused, Eli pulled out a small notepad and pen, writing a message to show the gathered crowd. "They are here because we helped fix a tire. Imagine what we can do together." The simple message brought smiles to some faces, while others remained skeptical. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "They're ex-cons, and can we trust them?" But for every doubting voice, there seemed to be someone stepping forward with an offering of help or refreshment. Reverend Luke moved through the gathering with practiced ease, his weathered face beaming. "I'll coordinate meals," he announced. "We'll need to feed these fine folks while they work. Anyone willing to help with that, come see me." Several church ladies immediately clustered around him, already planning potluck schedules. The work began as the sun climbed higher. Bikers shed their leather jackets, revealing arms covered in tattoos but also work-hardened muscles used to manual labor. They moved with purpose, clearing debris and marking out construction zones. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair introduced herself as an architect, spreading blueprints across a makeshift table. Another biker, his arms covered in military tattoos, organized teams for different tasks. Children from the neighborhood crept closer as the morning wore on, fascinated by the motorcycles and the strange mix of tough appearance and gentle demeanor displayed by the bikers. One burly man with a skull tattoo on his neck showed a group of kids how to safely handle a hammer, teaching them to drive nails into scrap wood. The children's laughter rang out across the worksite, breaking down more barriers than any words could have. By midday, the transformation was remarkable. The dusty lot had become an organized worksite, with piles of sorted materials and teams moving with purpose. Local contractors who had initially stayed away began showing up, offering their services and equipment. The mayor's secretary arrived with permit paperwork, expedited, and already approved. Maria watched it all with tears in her eyes, remembering her late husband and wishing he could see this moment. Bear noticed her expression and approached slowly, his usual gruff manner softening. "Your boys," he said. "They remind me of someone I used to know, someone who saw the good in folks, no matter what." As the sun began to set, work wound down for the day. The bikers and townspeople gathered around several campfires, sharing meals and stories. The barriers between them and us began to blur as people discovered shared experiences, common ground, and unexpected connections. At the largest fire, Bear sat with the Alvarez family and a small group of others. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face as he spoke of his past. "Lost my wife 15 years ago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Cancer took her quick. My daughter. She couldn't handle how I fell apart after. Haven't spoken to her in 12 years. He stared into the fire. "Quit believing in God right about then. Figured he'd quit on me first." Eli, watching the translation from his mother, picked up his notepad. His hands moved deliberately as he wrote, then showed the message to Bear. "You found us. Maybe God didn't quit on you." The big man blinked rapidly, turning his face away from the firelight. When he looked back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Maybe so, kid," he said gruffly. "Maybe so." The night deepened around them, stars appearing one by one above the desert town. The fires burned lower, casting a warm glow over faces that had been strangers that morning, but now shared something more. Hope had taken root in the ashes of loss, sprouting like a desert flower after rain. Around the fires, people continued to share stories and plans for the next day's work. The Alvarez boys moved from group to group, their silent language bridging gaps between worlds that had seemed unbridgeable. Their mother watched with pride as her sons helped create understanding where there had been fear, connection where there had been division. Reverend Luke moved among the gathering, offering quiet words of encouragement and watching with joy as his congregation expanded in unexpected ways. The night air carried the sound of laughter, the crackle of fires, and the soft murmur of conversations that would continue long into the night. In the distance, the shell of the burned community center stood as a reminder of what had been lost. But now, surrounded by motorcycles and filled with the energy of purpose, it no longer looked like an ending. Instead, it had become a beginning, a place where redemption would be built one nail, one board, and one act of kindness at a time. The events of that day had transformed more than just a worksite. They had begun to transform hearts, breaking down walls between communities that had seemed permanent. As the fires burned low and the desert night wrapped around them, the spark of hope that had been kindled continued to grow stronger, promising more changes to come with each new dawn. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as the reconstruction of the Hands of Hope Community Center entered its 5th day. The site buzzed with activity, a symphony of hammers, saws, and occasional bursts of laughter. The Alvarez boys moved confidently among the workers, their signing hands now supplemented with carpenter's pencils and measuring tapes. Noah balanced carefully on a stepladder while a biker called Tex, his arms covered in military tattoos, demonstrated the proper angle for driving nails into roof supports. Sammy sorted hardware with intense concentration, arranging nuts and bolts into careful piles. Eli worked alongside Bear, their hands moving in sync as they measured and marked lumber for cutting. Maria watched from the shade of a pop-up canopy, where she helped coordinate meals for the workers. Pride swelled in her chest as she observed her sons learning and growing, their faces bright, with purpose. The bikers had become their teachers, treating the boys not as disabled kids, but as eager apprentices. The morning peace shattered when Mayor Douglas Price's black SUV pulled up to the site. He stepped out in his pressed suit, looking severely out of place among the dust and construction debris. His face wore the tight smile of someone about to deliver unpleasant news. "Mr. Maddox," the mayor called out, waving a handful of papers. "We need to discuss some concerns about this project." Bear straightened up slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow as he approached the mayor. "Concerns?" he growled, wiping sawdust from his hands. Yes, well, Price cleared his throat. There are permits required, zoning regulations, safety inspections. The proper channels must be followed. Bear's eyes narrowed. We've got licensed contractors volunteering their time. Everything's up to code. Nevertheless, the mayor persisted, there are procedures. Red tape doesn't build dreams, Mr. Mayor, Bear snarled. These kids need this place. The whole town needs it. The confrontation drew attention. Workers paused, watching the exchange. The boys sensed the tension, their hands signing rapidly to each other with worry. As if the mayor's visit had opened a floodgate, more trouble arrived that afternoon. A group of business owners from the tourist district approached Maria as she distributed water bottles to the workers. Mrs. Alvarez, a woman in an expensive blouse, said, "We need to talk about these people you've brought to our town." Maria straightened her spine, though her heart pounded. These people are helping us rebuild. They're scaring away tourists, another shop owner complained. Yesterday, a tour bus changed its route to avoid this street. We can't afford this kind of disruption. Troublemakers, someone muttered. This isn't the image Clayton Ridge needs. The boys watched from nearby, their faces falling as they understood the hostility directed at their mother. Eli's hands clenched into fists. Noah's shoulders slumped. Sammy moved closer to Maria, pressing against her side. Bear watched the scene unfold, his jaw tight with anger. But before he could intervene, the sky darkened suddenly. The desert wind picked up, carrying the distinct smell of rain. "Storm coming!" someone shouted. "Secure the tarps!" The weather changed with frightening speed, a phenomenon common in the desert. Wind whipped through the construction site, carrying stinging sand. Lightning split the sky, followed by deafening thunder. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Workers scrambled to protect tools and materials, but the real danger became apparent when the wind caught the partially completed framework. The wooden skeleton of the building groaned ominously. "The south wall!" Bear bellowed over the storm. "It's giving way!" A massive support beam started to tilt. Without hesitation, Bear lunged forward, bracing his shoulder under the falling timber. His muscles strained as he fought against the weight, rain streaming down his face. The boys sprang into action. They might not have heard Bear's shout, but they understood the danger. Eli and Noah grabbed ropes, working with other volunteers to secure the wavering structure. Sammy ran to gather more stakes, his small form leaning into the wind. Minutes stretched like hours as they battled the storm. Bear held the beam steady while others worked to brace it properly. The rain was relentless, soaking everyone to the skin, but no one stopped working. Finally, the immediate danger passed. The framework held, though everyone knew how close they'd come to losing days of work. As the storm continued to rage, workers huddled under tarps and in vehicles, catching their breath. Bear found himself under a large tarp with the Alvarez boys. All four were drenched and exhausted. Thunder continued to roll across the sky, and lightning illuminated their faces in brief, bright flashes. Looking at the three boys, Bear felt something shift in his heart. Their determination, their refusal to quit, reminded him of everything he'd once believed in. Slowly, with careful concentration, he raised his hands and signed the words he'd been practicing in secret. "We keep building." The boys' faces lit up with surprised joy. They nodded vigorously, their own hands flying in encouraging responses. Though Bear couldn't understand most of their signing, their meaning was clear. They were in this together. As the storm began to break, someone had an idea. Several bikers maneuvered their motorcycles around the construction site, positioning them strategically. With a coordinated roar, they started their engines, and dozens of headlights illuminated the work area. Under this improvised lighting, they began to clean up and assess the damage. The framework had held. The foundation remained solid. Like the project itself, it had bent but not broken under pressure. Work continued into the night, the motorcycle headlights casting long shadows as people pulled together to strengthen what the storm had threatened to destroy. The boys worked alongside everyone else, their presence a reminder of why they were all there. The night air filled with the sounds of hammers, saws, and engines idling. Steam rose from the rain-soaked ground, creating an otherworldly atmosphere in the motorcycle lights. But the work continued, steady and determined, as the stars began to peek through breaks in the clouds above Clayton Ridge. The morning after the storm brought more than just clear skies to Clayton Ridge. Sarah Miller, owner of the Desert Rose Diner, stood in her empty restaurant, watching the bikers and volunteers working under the rising sun. The sight of the three Alvarez boys passing tools and carrying lumber alongside leather-clad bikers touched something in her heart. Making up her mind, she marched across the street, her sensible shoes clicking against the pavement. "Excuse me," she called, out to Bear. "I've got a proposition for you all." Bear turned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Ma'am?" "Those boys over there," she pointed to Eli, Noah, and Sammy. "They've been coming to my diner for years with their mama. Never caused trouble, always polite. And now I'm watching them work harder than grown men." She straightened her apron. "Starting today, breakfast and lunch are on the house for all your workers." Bear's weathered face showed surprise. "That's mighty generous, but we can't accept." "You can, and you will," Sarah interrupted firmly. "My kitchen, my rules. First shift starts at 6 o'clock sharp." Word spread quickly. By lunchtime, the Desert Rose was packed with hungry workers. The smell of coffee and fresh biscuits mixed with the sound of laughter and conversation. Sarah moved between tables, making sure everyone had full plates and warm coffee. At one table, Reverend Luke sat with a group of bikers, his collar slightly askew as he passed the syrup. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about Sunday's sermon, about how God's love often comes wrapped in unexpected packages." The following Sunday, the small church was unusually full. Bikers sat alongside regular parishioners, their leather vests contrasting with Sunday dresses. Reverend Luke stood at the pulpit, his kind eyes scanning the diverse congregation. "Today," he began, "I want to talk about unity, about how God brings people together in ways we never expect." His gaze settled on the Alvarez boys sitting with their mother. "Sometimes it takes children to teach us what real faith looks like. Sometimes it takes strangers to remind us what community means." Meanwhile, at the construction site, Bear had been watching Eli communicate with the other workers. One afternoon, he approached the teenager somewhat awkwardly. "Hey, kid," he called, then remembered to face Eli directly so he could read his lips. "Think you could teach me some of that?" He mimicked signing with his hands. Eli's face lit up. For the next hour, he patiently showed Bear basic signs. "Thank you. Please. Good morning." Bear's large fingers fumbled with the delicate movements, but he persisted, his face scrunched in concentration. Soon, other workers began joining these impromptu lessons. The sight of tough bikers practicing sign language became common. Tank, the tallest and most intimidating of the bunch, proved to be an eager student. Speaking of Tank, he had found an unexpected friend in young Sammy. It started when Sammy brought him a water bottle during a hot afternoon. Tank had been sitting alone, looking uncomfortable around the other children who sometimes visited the site. "Never been around kids much," Tank admitted to Bear later. "Don't know what to say to them." But Sammy didn't need words. He simply sat beside Tank during lunch breaks, sharing his cookies and teaching him simple signs. Tank's massive hands moved carefully, learning to speak in Sammy's language. "You're good with him," Bear observed one day. Tank shrugged, embarrassed. He doesn't look at me like I'm scary. Just sees me as me, I guess. The changes in Clayton Ridge were subtle but significant. Store owners who had initially posted "No Bikers" signs quietly took them down. Local families brought homemade dishes to the construction site. Children played nearby, no longer afraid of the leather-clad workers. One evening, as the sun painted the desert sky orange, Bear was cleaning up tools when he noticed something on a workbench. A Bible, its cover slightly dusty, lay open. He glanced around, but no one was watching. With calloused fingers, he picked it up. The pages fell open to a well-worn section. His eyes caught words about grace and redemption. For a long moment, he stood there, reading silently. His expression softened, though he quickly closed the book when he heard footsteps approaching. The town's transformation was evident in the growing number of volunteers. What had started as a biker-led project now included school teachers, shop owners, and retired couples. They worked side by side, sharing stories and sweat, breaking down barriers that had stood for years. But not everyone welcomed the change. In his office at City Hall, Mayor Douglas Price watched the community center taking shape with growing unease. His carefully maintained control over Clayton Ridge was slipping. "This isn't about the building anymore," he muttered to his assistant. "It's about order, structure. These people are disrupting everything we've built." He pulled out permit applications and zoning regulations, searching for any technicality he could use. The mayor's desk became cluttered with building codes and ordinances as he plotted to halt the construction legally. Back at the construction site, Bear watched the progress with pride. The framework was nearly complete, windows were being installed, and the roof would soon follow. But more importantly, he saw how the project had changed people, himself included. He thought about the Bible he'd found, about grace and second chances. Though he wasn't ready to pray, something had shifted inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart were beginning to crack, just like the walls of prejudice in Clayton Ridge were crumbling. As the sun set, Eli approached Bear with a new sign to teach him. Bear watched carefully as Eli demonstrated, then repeated the motion. "What's this one mean?" he asked. Eli smiled and wrote on his notepad, "Family." Bear looked around at the workers, the volunteers, the three brothers who had started it all. Family. Maybe that's what they were becoming. Not by blood, but by choice. By the simple act of building something together. The construction site grew quiet as darkness fell, but the spirit of unity that had taken root continued to grow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now the transformation of Clayton Ridge and its people continued, one helping hand at a time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the half-finished community center. Fresh paint cans stood ready, their lids gleaming with promise. Volunteers gathered early, eager to add color to the newly erected walls. Maria watched proudly as her three boys helped mix paint, their hands moving in excited signs about which shade of blue would look best. Bear supervised the work, his gruff exterior softening as he watched the boys demonstrate proper painting techniques to other volunteers. He'd learned enough sign language now to follow their basic instructions, and his chest swelled with pride at their leadership. The peaceful scene shattered at 10 o'clock. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the construction site, kicking up dust clouds that made everyone shield their eyes. City officials in pressed suits emerged, led by a smirking Mayor Douglas Price. He clutched a thick folder of papers in his manicured hands. "Stop all work immediately," the mayor announced, his voice carrying across the site. "This is an illegal construction zone." The volunteers froze. Paintbrushes dripped blue spots onto the protective tarps below. Bear's face darkened as he approached the mayor, his boots leaving heavy impressions in the dirt. What do you mean, illegal? Bear's voice was dangerously low. We've been working here for weeks. Mayor Price's smile didn't reach his eyes as he pulled out a stack of documents. No proper permits, inadequate safety inspections, zoning violations. I'm afraid this project is completely unauthorized. Maria rushed forward, her hands trembling as she signed to Eli. The oldest brother quickly translated for Bear. We submitted all the paperwork. Reverend Luke helped us. Apparently not all of it, Mayor Price replied coolly. This construction must cease immediately. Bear's massive hands clenched into fists. His face flushed red beneath his gray beard. Without a word, he spun on his heel and stormed toward his motorcycle. The three brothers exchanged worried glances. They knew that look. They'd seen it in others before. The look of someone about to do something they couldn't take back. Bear kicked his bike to life, the engine roaring like an angry beast. He tore out of the lot, heading straight for Town Hall. The boys scrambled onto their bicycles, pedaling desperately to keep up. Maria called after them, her voice lost in the thunder of the motorcycle. Bear reached Town Hall first, parking his bike haphazardly on the sidewalk. He burst through the double doors, his heavy boots echoing off the marble floors. The secretary squeaked in fear as he passed, not even trying to stop him. The boys arrived just as Bear reached the mayor's office. They heard his voice boom through the hallway. You can't do this to these kids. Eli, Noah, and Sammy rushed inside. Bear stood at the mayor's desk, his massive hands planted on its polished surface, papers scattered across the floor from his entrance. Mayor Price sat in his leather chair, trying to maintain his composure despite his obvious fear. Mr. Maddox, this is highly inappropriate, the mayor began. Inappropriate? Bear's voice rose to a roar. You want to talk about inappropriate? How about crushing children's dreams with your bureaucratic nonsense? The mayor's hand inched toward his phone. I'll call security. Bear's fist raised, and for a terrible moment, everyone in the room held their breath. The boys had seen this before, the moment when anger won, when violence seemed like the only answer. But then Eli moved. The 17-year-old stepped between Bear and the mayor. His hands flew in precise, passionate signs. Though the mayor couldn't understand them, their meaning was clear in Eli's fierce expression and steady stance. Don't fight. Build. Bear's raised fist trembled in the air. He stared at Eli, seeing not just a deaf teenager, but a young man showing more wisdom than he'd managed in his 50-plus years. The boy's eyes held no fear, only determination and something else. Disappointment. Slowly, Bear lowered his hand. His broad shoulders sagged as the anger drained away, replaced by shame. These boys, who had every reason to be angry at the world, were teaching him about peace. I'm sorry, Bear whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at the boys, then at the mayor. I'm sorry. Without another word, he walked out of the office. The boys followed him to the parking lot where he stood beside his motorcycle, staring at nothing. He started, then shook his head. I'm no good for this project, no good for you boys. Before they could stop him, Bear swung onto his bike. The engine roared to life, drowning out their silent protests. He gave them one last look, his eyes wet with unshed tears, then rode away. The boys watched until his bike disappeared around the corner. They waited, hoping he'd turn around and come back. But the rumble of his engine faded into the distance, leaving only the hollow whisper of desert wind. That evening, Maria and the boys drove the quiet roads around Clayton Ridge, searching for any sign of Bear. They checked diners, gas stations, and truck stops. But Bear's distinctive bike was nowhere to be found. Other bikers from the Desert Wings Brotherhood joined the search, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. They knew Bear's usual haunts, but each came back shaking their heads. Their leader had vanished. As night fell, the boys stood at the half-built community center. Paint cans sat unopened, tarps fluttered in the breeze, and tools lay where they'd been dropped that morning. The structure seemed to loom in the darkness, its unpainted walls stark white under the stars. Eli picked up a paintbrush, remembering how excited they'd been that morning. Noah ran his hand along a wall they'd helped build. Sammy clutched the leather coin with the angel wing emblem that Bear had given them weeks ago on that dusty road. Maria wrapped her arms around her sons, her heart aching for their disappointment. The distant sound of motorcycle engines echoed off the mountains, but they weren't Bears. One by one, the remaining bikers returned to their camp, their headlights sweeping across the empty building like searching eyes. The community center stood silent, a half-finished dream under the desert stars. The warmth and energy that had filled it just hours ago had vanished with Bear, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed to echo with all their unanswered questions. In the quiet darkness, Maria signed to her boys. Sometimes people need time to find their way back to themselves. They nodded, but their eyes kept returning to the road where Bear had disappeared. The night grew deeper, and still they waited, hoping to hear the familiar rumble of his return. The desert sun rose and set 5 times, each day dimming the hope that Bear would return. One by one, the motorcycles that had filled the lot began to disappear, their riders offering apologetic goodbyes to Maria and her boys. "Can't stay forever, ma'am," a weathered biker named Tank explained, his eyes downcast as he packed his saddlebags. "Got jobs to get back to, family's waiting." He hugged Sammy goodbye, the 12-year-old's small frame almost disappearing in his embrace. The once bustling construction site grew quiet. Tools lay scattered where they'd been dropped the day of Bear's departure, gathering dust under the harsh Arizona sun. Paint cans dried unopened, their promised colors locked away. Every afternoon after school, the boys rode their bicycles to the half-finished community center. They swept away tumbleweeds, picked up loose nails, and straightened the tarps that flapped in the wind. Their dedication touched Maria's heart, even as it worried her. "Maybe it's time to let go," she signed one evening, watching them organize tools they might never use again. Eli shook his head firmly. "Bear will come back," he signed. "He has to." Noah and Sammy nodded in agreement, their faith unshaken despite the emptying parking lot and growing silence. Reverend Luke visited often, bringing cold lemonade and warm encouragement. One particularly hot afternoon, he found Maria and the boys sitting in the shade of the unfinished walls. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, settling beside them on a stack of lumber. "Sometimes he takes us on a longer road to teach us something important." "What's he teaching us now?" Maria asked softly. The Reverend smiled, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Maybe patience, maybe faith, or maybe he's teaching someone else entirely." He looked meaningfully at the empty road where Bear had disappeared. That evening, Eli discovered Bear's handwriting notebook tucked away in the tool shed. The pages were filled with Bear's careful attempts to learn the alphabet in sign language, each letter practiced dozens of times. Eli ran his fingers over the indentations, feeling the dedication in every stroke. "We should leave him a message," Noah signed excitedly, "in case he comes back at night." Together, the brothers tore out a clean page and wrote in careful letters, "We're still building, Bear." They tied it to the fence post near the entrance, weighing it down with one of the angel wing coins he'd given them that first day on the desert road. Maria watched her sons from their trailer window, her heart swelling with pride at their unwavering hope. That night, she placed 3 candles in the window, one for each of her boys, Their light stretched across the empty lot toward the highway, a beacon in the darkness. "Please guide him home," she whispered, her prayer joining countless others she'd offered since Bear's departure. The remaining bikers packed up their last belongings the next morning. The rumble of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind only memories and half-built dreams. The community center stood like a skeleton against the sky, its framework reaching toward heaven, but stopped short of completion. As twilight settled over Clayton Ridge, Maria and her boys made their nightly visit to the site. The note fluttered in the evening breeze, still waiting to be read. They checked the tools, straightened what needed straightening, and held on to their faith for one more day. The highway stretched into darkness, a ribbon of black against the purple desert sky. Maria wrapped her arms around her sons as they prepared to leave, when something made them pause. On the edge of hearing, barely louder than a whisper, came a sound they'd been waiting for. A low, distant rumble carried on the wind. They stood perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound faded, then grew stronger, then faded again, playing hide-and-seek with their hopes in the gathering dark. The Clayton Ridge Community Church stood quiet that Sunday morning, sunlight streaming through its modest stained glass windows. Reverend Luke's sermon about perseverance echoed through the half-filled pews, his words touching hearts still heavy with disappointment. Maria and her 3 boys sat in their usual spot, their hands moving in gentle signs as they translated the message for each other. Eli, aged 17, noticed his mother's tired eyes and gave her hand a squeeze. The past week had been particularly hard, watching the last few bikers pack up and leave. Then, cutting through the reverent silence, came a sound that made every head turn. At first it was just a whisper, a low rumble that might have been thunder. But it grew steadily louder, building like an approaching storm. People began rising from their pews, curiosity overwhelming decorum. Reverend Luke paused mid-sentence, a knowing smile crossing his weathered face. "Perhaps we should step outside and see what the Lord has brought us today." The congregation spilled onto the church steps, hands raised against the brilliant Arizona sun. Maria and her boys pushed through the crowd, their hearts pounding with recognition of that familiar sound. There, on the horizon, stretching as far as the eye could see, was a river of chrome and steel. Thousands of motorcycles approached in formation, their engines creating a symphony that echoed off the desert hills. Leading them all was a familiar figure, Bear Maddox, his gray hair whipping in the wind, his leather vest bearing the angel wing emblem that had come to mean so much to the town. Tears streamed freely down Bear's weathered cheeks as he led the massive convoy into Clayton Ridge. Behind him rode an army of compassion, Christian motorcycle ministries, veteran support groups, charity riders from across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and beyond. Each bike carried someone who had heard Bear's story and chosen to answer his call. "Oh my God," Maria whispered, her hands trembling as she signed the news to her sons. The boys jumped and waved, their silent joy speaking volumes. Bear brought his bike to a stop in front of the church, the rumble of thousands of engines gradually falling silent. He climbed off, removed his sunglasses, and faced the astonished crowd. "I made a promise," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and I aim to keep it. These folks," he gestured to the sea of bikers behind him, "they're here because they believe in what we started. We're finishing what we began. Every last nail, every last board." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Reverend Luke stepped forward, extending his hand to Bear, but the big biker pulled him into a bear hug instead. "The permits," someone began. "All taken care of," Bear announced. Got lawyers who ride? They worked it out while I was gathering the troops. Everything's legal now. Mayor Price can't stop us anymore." As if summoned by his name, Mayor Douglas Price appeared on his front porch across the street. He stood frozen, watching the incredible scene unfold. The power he'd wielded through paperwork and bureaucracy seemed to evaporate in the face of such overwhelming solidarity. The boys ran to Bear, their faces beaming. He awkwardly signed, "Hello." He'd clearly been practicing, and then reached into his saddlebag. Out came rolls of construction plans, properly stamped and approved. "No more half measures," he declared. "We're building it right, building it better than before. These people didn't just come to swing hammers. They brought donations, supplies, skills, everything we need." Within an hour, the construction site transformed into a hive of activity. Bikers in leather vests worked alongside church ladies in their Sunday best. The sound of hammers and saws mixed with laughter and conversation. Someone set up a food station, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. Maria watched it all through tears of joy, her boys darting excitedly through the crowd. She saw Tank return with a group of veterans, saw familiar faces from the first attempt now mixed with hundreds of new ones, all united in purpose. Bear found a quiet moment to approach her. "I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye," he said softly. "But I needed to do this right. These boys, your boys, they taught me something about faith, about not giving up. I had to prove worthy of that lesson." The transformation was remarkable. The man who had once cursed at a flat tire now stood as a leader of this massive effort of love and redemption. And as the day progressed, even those who had opposed the project found themselves drawn in by the infectious spirit of unity and purpose. The final day of construction dawned bright and full of promise. Dozens of ladders leaned against freshly painted walls as volunteers worked together on vibrant murals. Noah's original sketches had inspired the designs, hand-signing words of hope and love stretched across the building's exterior, each one telling a story of faith, family, and perseverance. Bear found Maria near the entrance, his usual gruff demeanor softened by emotion. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, shifting his weight. "When I disappeared, I went to find my daughter, Grace. She's a nurse in Phoenix. We haven't spoken in years, but after seeing your family..." His voice cracked. "She's on her way here today." Maria squeezed his hand, understanding in her eyes. Eli and Noah worked side by side with Tank and other bikers, carefully installing a wheelchair ramp at the entrance. Their precise measurements and attention to detail showed in every angle. Meanwhile, Sammy darted around the front garden, planting bright marigolds and desert wildflowers with careful hands. As the sun began its descent, the new building caught the light like polished gold. Reverend Luke gathered everyone in a circle, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This place," he declared, "isn't built by bricks, it's built by hearts that refuse to quit." The entire community, bikers, townspeople, and the Alvarez family, joined hands in a massive circle. Even Mayor Price stood among them, his previous opposition forgotten in this moment of unity. Together they bowed their heads in silent prayer as Bear and Eli mounted the ladder to hang the final touch, a wooden sign reading Hands of Hope Community Center. The next morning dawned with promise, painting the desert in soft amber hues. A silver sedan pulled into the community center's parking lot, its tires crunching on fresh gravel. Grace Maddox stepped out, her nurse's ID badge still clipped to her blouse. She hesitated for just a moment before her eyes found her father. Bear stood frozen, his weathered face a mix of hope and fear. Then Grace ran, closing the distance between them in seconds, throwing herself into his arms. "Daddy," she sobbed, burying her face in his leather vest. Bear's shoulders shook as he held his daughter close, years of regret washing away in a flood of tears. The gathered crowd watched in reverent silence as father and daughter reunited. With trembling hands, Bear slowly removed his leather vest, walking deliberately to the center's entrance. He hung it carefully beside a newly mounted bronze plaque that read, "Built by those who couldn't hear, but listened better than the rest." One by one, the bikers started their engines, a rolling thunder of farewell. The Desert Wings Brotherhood departed in groups, leaving behind not chaos, but hope. Eli, Noah, and Sammy stood waving, their hands raised proudly against the morning sky. Bear turned to the boys, his hands moving slowly but purposefully as he signed. Family. The word carried weight beyond its simple gesture. Maria embraced her sons, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You changed the world with silence," she whispered, though they couldn't hear the words. They felt their meaning in her touch. As evening settled over Clayton Ridge, the brothers played beneath the vibrant mural, their laughter mixing with the desert cicada's song. In the distance, Bear's Harley rumbled softly, no longer a sound of rebellion, but a gentle reminder of redemption found in unexpected places. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.